This might be the most expensive fabric that I have personally ever bought. Now comes the eternal question that one must ask oneself every time you get a new piece of fabric, especially wool. Are we going to wash it? Hello and good morning everyone, I'm Morgan Donner and today I wanted to talk to you about pre-washing your fabric before you make it into a garment, specifically wool fabric. I received my new fabric weeks ago and I love it. I think it is absolutely the perfect fit for my medieval Greenland dress that I've been working on. But I've been really dreading the next step in this process, the pre-washing. So I've heard all the horror stories, like my friend who made a really lovely wool doublet, and then when it came out of the wash the very first time, it had shrunken several sizes and he could never wear it again. And I've heard similar stories about all sorts of shirts, pants, skirts, and various other fitted items. I also know from personal experience that the hand of the fabric, the feel, the look, the essence of the fabric can really change drastically when you wash it the first time. The fabric that you purchased is not the fabric that you end up with, sort of, you know? And because of all of that, I've been really putting off starting the next part of my project because I'm so nervous about this step. Fortunately, I remembered that I have a pair of tools in my embroidered tie-on pouch down here. Research and testing. My research stage revealed two main schools of thought on this. The first school is to just wash the absolute fluff out of your wool. Hot water, hot, dry, treat it as badly as you possibly can so that when you shrink it completely now, you never have to worry about it shrinking later as a finished garment. Shrinking aside, if the overall look and feel of your fabric is going to change, at least you'll know now before you've spent all that time making it into a nice piece of clothing, right? On the other hand, the other end of the spectrum, you have some people who feel that you should do nothing with it at all. Treat your wool items with absolute care that they deserve. You do that by blousing up your skirts to keep them out of the mud, wearing aprons or other protective items of clothing when appropriate. And when inevitably something actually does end up getting a little bit dirty, very carefully spot cleaning that as needed. And of course, a lot of people fall somewhere in the middle of that spectrum, maybe pre-wash, but only with cold water. Tumble dry is okay as long as there's no heat. Or nope, you should only ever hang dry, or steam only, using very special detergents only. Lots of different possibilities there. A quick side note for those of you for whom this is maybe your first video you've seen of mine, and thus you might not be aware that all of this conversation is taking place in the context of medieval costuming. And generally, you would be wearing at least one layer of linen beneath all of that wool. No matter whether we're talking about a skirt or a dress or sleeves or a jacket or a doublet, you'll always have on some layers below your fancy wool fabric, and that will protect your outer clothing from getting skin cells and sweat and oil and so much on them, right? Laundering is something that really doesn't need to happen terribly often, but this conversation is kind of sort of about when you do end up needing to wash your item, which happens. The research, while fascinating, really didn't give me a clear path ahead, so that's where part 2 comes in, the testing. I decided that it would really be worth my time and effort to go ahead and see what a few different of those fabric pre-treatment techniques might look like on my particular fabric. Inspired and absolutely delighted by the brilliant rotary cutting skills of one Marika at Enchanted Rose Costuming, I purchased and for the very first time used a rotary blade to precisely cut out 4 identical swatches. Well, almost identical. If you were like me about 3 hours ago and don't have a rotary cutting setup, then you could also just cut your square out freehand and then trace around it on a piece of paper. Instead of worrying about exact measurements that way, you can just lay your swatch back on your piece of paper when your experiment is done to see how much it shrank or not. On some fabrics, the warp and the weft of the fabric is really easy to identify because there's some sort of pattern or directional print on it, but this twill is kind of subtle enough that I'm going to have to add a little notch here in the same direction as my selvage. Okay, so the paper method is good and all, but I'm in a little bit of a perfectionist mood, so I would really just like all 4 of my swatches to be the same. Thank you very much. So I'll go ahead and stack them on top of each other and give them an extra pass under the blade, neatly making them all exactly 5.5 inches on all sides. To add grain direction for the other pieces, and also making it easy to differentiate them later on to boot, I've added increasing numbers of notches to the other swatches, leaving the last control piece without any notches at all. I decided to test out the most extreme end of the spectrum first, hot wash with a hot dry. The second swatch, with 2 notch marks, will be washed with cold water and then left out to air dry. The third swatch was tested using a method that I found mentioned in one of the Foundations Revealed live workshops, wetting a cloth, rolling the fabric in it, and then letting it sit overnight, or in my case a few hours, and then steaming it. Some of the heat and the moisture from method 1, but without all the agitation of the washer. So my tests have been completed, but it is a little bit difficult to compare some of these swatches with some of them being so wrinkly, so I went ahead and ironed those, especially the hot wash and dry swatch, since it was the most wrinkled, and a little bit more steam isn't exactly likely to shrink it any further. To keep the cold one as far away from heat as possible though, I lowered the heat on my iron to its coolest setting and only ironed it very briefly. So our results are as follows. Starting with the control swatch, we have a 5.5 inch square as our start, our base point, and that's what we'll compare everything else to. On the single notch piece, which was the hot wash, hot dry, the first thing I noticed here is that my square is, it has become a rhombus. The twill weave has been awakened by the water and decided to sort of dance the top of the square off to the side. And the slight fraying from the wash makes it a little bit difficult to tell if the fabric has actually shrunk any. Maybe a 1/16 of an inch at worst. The 2 notch piece is in, and this was the cold wash air dry test, and it has also gone a bit tilty. Perhaps an 1/8 of an inch lost here to shrinkage. Again, it's really hard to tell with all the frayed edges, which is a variable that I didn't really consider when I started this test. Anyways, the 3 notch test is looking pretty good with only a wee little bit of fraying and some more rhombus action. Hardly any visible shrinking. Maybe a 1/16 of an inch. The visible texture is mostly unchanged, although the 2 notch, the cold water test, is oddly the fluffiest. I would have guessed that to be the case for the hot water, hot dry test. One possible reason that I could think of was that the first test piece was washed with fairly smooth clothing items, while notch 2 piece was washed with several towels, and perhaps they roughed up the swatch more than test 1. Also, test 1 and 3 both got a really strong, thorough ironing, so perhaps the stronger iron application sort of smoothed the fibers down a bit. All in all, my fabric has surprisingly changed very little in the 3 tests, which is completely great. I had somewhat feared that when I washed this, it would shrink down to like half its size and become a felty, sad mess. I'm really relieved for a number of reasons that that is not the case, and I'm excited that it's totally okay to go ahead and use this fabric for its intended purpose. If it had shrunk down a lot, that wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, but because I only have just enough fabric for this dress, I was definitely worried that it would shrink too much and then I wouldn't have enough fabric for my dress. The peace of mind that this is giving me is completely fantastic, and if you have a dress that you're considering making but you're really unsure about the whole fabric situation like I was, consider doing a test swatch to test your fabric and see how it goes. Fortunately, my fabric is a really light colored fabric. I didn't even have to worry about the whole color fastness aspect of this whole thing, but that is also another great reason to do a swatch test. Perhaps even washing your swatch several times to see if there might be some fading issues or color transfer problems that you'd want to know about. So in the end, because my fabric has very little shrinkage for me to worry about, my garment is going to be unlined, so I don't even have to worry about different shrinkages from different fabrics competing with each other. And my dress has a ton of ease. It's a loose dress, so whatever little shrinkage there might end up being, it's not going to make it so small that I won't be able to fit into it anymore. For these reasons, I'm not gonna actually worry about pre-washing my fabric. This video has essentially become, look at me, I did nothing to my fabric. But it has given me the confidence to go ahead and continue with my project, and it was the research and the testing that got me there. So if you have a project that you're putting off starting because of similar fabric worries, then perhaps it's time for you to go ahead and do a series of swatch tests.